I'm Paul Taylor, and welcome to this week's topic, which is all about sleep. Most of us are big fans of sleep, and we know how our night sleep can either make or break our day. But in this topic, I want to delve into the science and give you a really good understanding of why sleep is important, what happens when we don't get enough sleep, and how we can actually improve our sleep. So, firstly, let's talk about why it's important. Well, what we know is that when we're asleep, the body is basically repairing itself. All throughout the body and the brain, there is all sorts of things going on to repair cellular processes and different systems within the body. So, for instance, we know that when we're asleep, our cardiovascular system repairs any damage that's done to it is getting repaired. Same with our immune system. There's lots of repair that happens when we sleep. Our muscular system, that is when we regenerate, when we recover from exercise. There's lots of growth hormone released when we're asleep that helps to rebuild muscle or make muscle stronger. Our endocrine or our hormonal system undergoes widespread repair whenever we're asleep. And we also know that the brain, sleep is really, really important for it. This is when learning and memory, learning happens and memory gets consolidated when we're asleep. We know that the areas for the brain that control our emotions are repaired when we're asleep. And we also know that sleep is very important for mood. And I think everybody would know that. But the other thing that started to become clear over the last number of years is a recent discovery has been about what we call the glymphatic system. Now, most of you will have heard of the lymphatic system in the body. So the lymphatic system is basically how the body gets rid of waste products from cellular metabolism. But we don't have a lymphatic system in the brain. So it's puzzled scientists for decades about how the brain gets rid of its waste products, because just through the process of metabolism of cells staying alive, they produce a lot of waste, which can be toxic. So a number of years ago, scientists discovered this glymphatic system. And what they found is that when we're asleep, it's basically a system of tunnels, if you like, that happens around our cardiovascular system. And what happens is the intracellular spaces, the spaces around our nerve cells in the brain, actually become bigger when we're asleep, and the nerve cells will dump their waste products into this system, and then it drains out through the blood-brain barrier and into the lymphatic system. So if we look over here down at the bottom right, these green things, they're neurons, and the purple ones are astrocytes, so they're support cells in the brain. Here you can look at a young person's brain, and particularly we want to look at these, the metabolic waste and things called beta amyloid, which are heavily implicated in Alzheimer's disease and other brain pathologies. We can see that with a young brain, there's not a lot of accumulation of this waste product. With an older brain, we get more accumulation. And here's typically what we see in Alzheimer's disease, is there's a large buildup in metabolic waste and a large buildup of these beta amyloid plaques, which are heavily implicated in Alzheimer's and in other conditions. So when we don't get a lot of sleep, these waste products and beta amyloid build up, because what we now know is that the glymphatic system operates almost exclusively at night. And not only is it important for getting rid of all of our waste products, but the glymphatic system is also used to distribute important things for the brain like glucose, amino acid, lipids or fats, and also growth factors are also distributed throughout the brain through this glymphatic system. So it's a hugely important system that really only operates when we're asleep. And that's why we're seeing that sleep is so important for general brain function. But some other reasons why sleep is important, really my experience of this was going through combat survival and resistance to interrogation training when we were subject to quite severe sleep deprivation. And I know what it can do, not only to your mood, but to your brain, to hallucinations and all this sort of stuff. And it's a very well established interrogation technique and form of psychological torture, severe sleep deprivation. And the other thing, the big reason why we should understand that sleep's important is that if you go for very long periods without any sleep at all, you will actually die. The world record is actually held by a US guy. He was a student at the time, a guy called Randy Gardner, who managed to go for 11 days without sleep. And that is the longest ever recorded by a human. But he was probably having lots of little, what we call micro sleeps, where the brain falls asleep for 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And what we know now is that most people would start to die after around 10, 11 plus days of sleep. So that should kind of say something about how important it is, particularly when you look at the fact that we can go for months without food and still be alive. So before we dive into the science a little bit more, it's important to understand that sleep very strongly interacts with stress. And most people will get that. When you're stressed, you know that it impairs your sleep. So let's have a look at this cycle that goes on. So in terms of stress, we need some sort of stimulus, something around us to be potentially stressful. And the first thing that dictates whether something's is stressful is our perception. So it's important to understand that our species is the only species whose thoughts can activate their stress response system. That means that you can ruminate about something that happened 10 years ago or an argument that you had last week, and you will have a very strong stress response system. You can also catastrophize about something that might happen next week or what somebody might be thinking of you when you don't actually know if that's true. And you will create a massive stress response. So the key thing to understand is that perception is the biggest driver of stress. And then it's about, in the moment to moment when you are stressed, how do you react to that in the short term? And then what is your coping strategy, not only in the short term, but at the end of the day? If you've had a very stressful day, what is your go-to strategy? Do you have what we call an adaptive coping strategy, such as exercise, yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, these things that are all shown to reduce stress, or a more maladaptive coping strategy where you're reaching for alcohol or food or drugs to be able to soothe that anxiety. Now, this coping strategy is very important because it has an immediate knock-on effect to your sleep quality. And we've talked about how sleep is important for cleaning the brain of toxin, but we know, for instance, that alcohol will have very detrimental effect on your sleep. And we see that alcohol reduces the overall quality of the sleep, but particularly it reduces your REM time. So we have these different stages of sleep, non-REM and REM, which is rapid eye movement. And that's where essentially that's when dreaming happens, but it is important for memory consolidation. And it's really important for regeneration. So we know that alcohol will affect global sleep, so the overall quality of your sleep, but particularly this REM, which impacts negatively upon your learning and memory, and you end up with much less restorative sleep than you would have. We also know that eating unhealthy foods can also have a negative impact on your sleep, as can drugs and other things. And then there is metabolic effects of not having a good night's sleep. So there are a heap of physiological consequences which we'll go through later on, but we know that even modest sleep restriction, so even an hour and a half or an hour to 2 hours less sleep than you would normally get, has a very detrimental impact on performance. We know through studies that people who are modestly sleep restricted actually do worse in both driving tests and in tests of cognition than people who are over the legal drinking limit. So they do worse than people who are drunk. And the other thing which we'll touch on later is these inflammatory cytokines. So inflammation is basically one of the triggers of long-term disease. So we have those consequences, but we also know that when you have a bad night's sleep, it makes you more stress responsive the next day because it impacts upon your stress response systems and things like cortisol that's released at higher levels the next day. So you start the next day more susceptible to stress. And this then can be this horrible cycle that lots of us will recognize. So it is really important to understand that there is that strong interaction between the stress that we have, our coping strategy, and our sleep quality, and then the impact the next day. So let's take a bit of a look at the evidence of what happens in the short and the long term when we don't get enough sleep. So in terms of the short-term consequences, so we've talked about the impact on your performance. And the thing is, from these tests is that people who are sleep deprived actually think they've done well in these tests, whereas people who are over the alcohol limit know that they actually haven't done so well. So that's a bit scary, particularly when you think of the impact on the workplace, that you're coming in, your performance is off, and you're not aware that your performance is off. Other things that we know about sleep and short sleep or reduced sleep is that it changes certain hormones that have a very significant impact on how much you eat and move the next day. So we know that this hormone ghrelin is basically the hunger hormone. And when it is higher, as happens when you have a lack of sleep, it makes you hungry the next day. And some people may have noticed this. Now, leptin is your off switch for food. It's the bit that says when you're eating, okay, I'm actually full now, I'll stop eating. So that's reduced. So not only are you hungrier, but you keep eating. And the other thing that's really important about leptin is that leptin actually drives voluntary physical activity. So when you're sleep deprived, it means that you move less the next day. And we know that when you move less the next day, it's going to have a negative impact on your sleep. We see that when people exercise, they sleep better. When they sleep better, they exercise more. And that is mediated through this hormone leptin. So we see that when people have short sleep duration, they tend to get fatter over time. And it's because of the impact of these two hormones. And then the last thing we want to look at is these physiological consequences of sleep deprivation. So this study, or sleep restriction, sorry. This study looked at the impact on the brain. You had slower working memory, so basically your brain was not functioning as well, and we've seen that in lots of different performance studies. Lots of lapses in concentration. Which is obviously a very important thing if you're in the workplace. We also had reduced overall cognition, so your brain just is not working as well as it would do on a good night's sleep. And we see in lots of studies depressed mood that comes with a lack of sleep. And also critically, more rumination around thoughts. So you tend to linger longer with your thoughts, you ruminate, you have more negative thinking. That then has an impact on your ability to sleep the next night, and it can be this really nasty cycle. Now, in terms of more systemic impacts, we know that negative sleep or lack of sleep impacts on your endocrine function. So your hormonal system is a little bit off. Your metabolic function is also off. Now, these two systems are hugely important for the overall function and health of our body over the long term. And also very critically, lack of sleep drives inflammation at a cellular level, which we have seen is one of the biggest triggers of all chronic diseases. So we see this play out in large studies of people. And here was a big national health survey that was done on 30,000 different people, looking at how much sleep they had and then the association with different diseases. And although it's not causative, we can infer a lot from these sorts of studies, particularly when we understand the mechanisms. And here, I just want to look at a couple of things. So odds ratio is basically your risk relative to the reference. So the reference here is having 7 hours sleep. So here's a comparison of cardiovascular disease in different amounts of sleep with people. So basically this is saying that for people less than 60 years who had less than or equal to 5 hours sleep a night, they had 3 times the incidence of cardiovascular disease of those who have 7 hours sleep a night. So we can see that it's more important when you're under 60, when age over 60. This is still very significant. 160% increase in cardiovascular disease. However, we know that as you get older, your need for sleep is a little bit less. So that's why particularly we see it when you're younger, not having a lot of sleep consistently can have a huge impact on cardiovascular disease. Even 6 hours sleep, 1.77 times the odds ratio. But we can also see that too much sleep has a negative impact as well. Now, some of the data out of this is that people who are depressed or have ill health tend to sleep more. So we don't know whether this is cause or effect, but we certainly know that this is definitely causative. So that's just cardiovascular disease. What we've also seen over long-term studies is that people with shorter sleep have greater risk of Alzheimer's disease. And again, it's an association study, but we now understand the mechanisms through this glymphatic system. So here is the brain when you're awake, and you can see that the interstitial spaces, the spaces between these cells, isn't great. But when we're asleep, there's more spaces, you get more flow through there, and basically it clears those wastes. So particularly those amyloid plaques that we saw earlier on, the beta amyloid, are very important in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And it's not just Alzheimer's, there's other neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with a lack of sleep. And here was a big study done in the late 70s on 1 million people. And what they looked at was death rate of all-cause mortality over time and sleep. And so what we can see here is that if you compare 7 to 8 hours of sleep, people who had routinely 4 to 5 hours sleep had double the risk of death from any cause as those who have 7 to 8 hours sleep. And we know that this is pretty much the sweet spot, is around that 7 to 8 hours is pretty key. And here again, you can see people with too much sleep, obviously not good as well. So that's all a bit depressing, but let's talk about what we can do about it to get a better night's sleep. And there has been a lot of studies done looking at, particularly in sleep labs, how we can improve people's quality of sleep. And so here are some of the things that are very well established. So the first one is a routine. It is hugely, hugely important. So our circadian cycle, that sleep-wake cycle, is largely driven by routines. And we can mess with our circadian cycle by changing the time that we go to bed and the time that we get up. And the first thing that they do on people who have real bad sleep problems, when they go to basically into sleep school, they put them into a very strict routine. They go to bed the same time every night, and they get up at the same time every morning, no matter what time they actually get to sleep. So this routine is pretty damn key. So it is important that you try to go to bed at the same time every night. And we know going to bed earlier is much, much better. That early sleep is really important. And we know that if you have reduced sleep, you miss out on things like growth hormone, which you get more of later on in the night. So it is important that we get into this routine. Now, if you have issues getting to sleep in terms of you have a busy head, there's a lot of stuff in your mind, something that's a very useful tool is what I call a dump pad. So before you even think about going to bed, particularly if you've been working, a dump pad is where basically you write down all the things that are on your mind, because basically that will give you some cognitive closure. Because when we're asleep, the brain runs through the day's events, deciding what is important to store. And that's often when we get, oh my God, I forgot to do that, and the brain will wake you up. So this dump pad will actually give you a bit of cognitive closure, and lots of people who I've worked with who've used this have said it is very, very effective. Next thing that is very important is that you have a wind down routine. And that wind down routine is basically should happen from early evening, and that's where you start to dim the lights, and that sends important signals through your eye lens into the brain, into a part of the brain called the SCN, which is important in regulating sleep. So it needs to get these signals to say, okay, it is starting to get time to sleep. And then it's about you unplugging from work and just doing something relaxing. So ideally you would turn the screens off. I'll talk about that in a minute, and do something that's relaxing, whether it is some meditation, some reading, some yoga, tai chi, whatever that may be, just having a bath, something that will just help you to wind down and get ready for sleep, because we can't switch our brain on and off just like a light switch. Next thing that's important for your room is to have your room as dark as possible. A recent UK study showed that the quality of your sleep is related to the darkness of your room. And for the best quality of sleep, they suggested that you shouldn't be able to see the wall on the other side of your room. And the same goes for noise. Having a quiet room is very important. So if you are live somewhere where your bedroom is noisy, wearing earplugs or something like that can really help. Another thing that's very important is to have your room cool. The room should be no more than about 17 degrees centigrade whenever you're sleeping. 16 to 17 is the optimal temperature for sleeping. When your room is too hot, it will definitely impair your sleep. And the other thing is that the bedroom should be a sanctuary. It is where you go to sleep. And if you're lucky, you get a bit of oofty magoofty, but that's it. It should not be somewhere where you go to do work or watch television or any of those other things. The brain needs to know that this is the place that I go for sleep, which leads into the things that we shouldn't do. So firstly, caffeine. Now, caffeine is a stimulant. It will keep the brain awake, as we all know. That helps us to wake us up. But the important thing is that caffeine has a half-life of about 6 hours. That means 6 hours after you've had a cup of coffee or some caffeine from whether it's sugar-free drinks or whatever that may be, half that caffeine is still in your system. So if you're having multiple sources of caffeine throughout the day, that caffeine is actually building up and building up. And then you can go to sleep try to go to sleep at 10, 11 o'clock, whatever it may be, and your brain is basically firing off caffeine, and it will significantly impair your sleep quality. So I recommend you don't have any caffeine after midday if you have problems with sleep. Some people don't have problems with caffeine. The other thing, alcohol, we talked about that earlier on. Now we know that 1 or 2 drinks will help get to sleep, right? And it seems to calm some people down. So 1 to 2 drinks can be reasonably beneficial in sleep, but certainly more than that starts to have very negative consequences on the quality of your sleep. And the other thing that can have very negative consequences is any sort of a screen that emits blue light, such as a television, an iPad, and the newer types of book readers like Kindles have these blue lights. Also our phones, any sorts of computer devices give off this blue light, and what the recent research has shown is if you interact with blue light, any sort of a screen, within an hour of going to sleep, melatonin, your sleep hormone, drops by 28%. So if you have problems with sleep, it is pretty critical that you turn off all devices, ideally an hour before you go to sleep, or at least half an hour before you go to sleep, and do this wind down routine to get your brain ready for sleep. So there are a couple of things out there in the technology world which can be very useful, particularly for people who have to do some work late at night. And this thing just gets Flux. You just download it onto your computer or your tablet, and basically it turns it from that blue light into the orange light. So it looks a little bit strange, but it won't have that negative impact on melatonin in the brain. So if you do need to work late at night, this is absolutely critical. So here are some other things that will help if you're having issues with sleep. So this thing down the bottom, this Dawn Simulator alarm clock. So what it does, it's very clever devices. When you set a particular time for waking up, a while before that, it will start to emit a little bit of light. Now, even when you're asleep, that light will get into your brain and start to tell your brain, okay, it's starting to become daylight. And the brain will actually wake you up. This thing is programmed so that it will wake you up when you're in light sleep. And then you will feel so much better. It's when your alarm clock goes off that you're in deep sleep that you will feel like you've been run over by a truck. So with the, from that thing, another thing that we can do is setting our mental alarm clock. So if you need to get up at, say, 6:30, set a mental alarm clock for 6:20. So just as you're going to bed, just picture in your mind's eye 6:20, whatever your clock is, your alarm clock. If it's digital, picture digital. If it's analog, picture analog. And just mentally rehearsing just in your brain, just visualize waking up at 6:20. You will be very surprised how accurate that can be. And the more often you use your mental alarm clock, the better. Now, what the studies have shown is that even if you have a short night's sleep, if you set that mental alarm clock, the brain will basically prioritize the sleep and it'll change your pattern so that you wake up when you're in light sleep and you feel much, much better. So those two techniques are very, very effective for waking more refreshed. Here's another option to those to the blue screen is orange filtered glasses will actually filter out the blue light and have less of an effect on your brain. So very, very useful for helping you get to sleep. Things for resetting your circadian cycle. So what it's very important to do is to get exposed to sunlight as early as possible. So if you have sleep problems when you get up in the morning, or if you're traveling to a different time zone, as in the morning as early as possible, get out into bright sunlight. So it is that sunlight that will help set your circadian rhythms, and you should do that several times a day. So ideally in the morning, get into sunlight. At lunchtime, get out there, and then in the afternoon, get out again with sunlight. But they have created these devices such as glasses, which will emit blue light. There's actually things that you can plug into your ear and it will emit blue light through there, and actually it's been proven to have an impact on the brain as well. But there are these different forms of light boxes. I personally have this one, which I find very useful if I'm traveling in different time zones. You just put it on your desk, slightly off center, and it eliminates blue light at around 10,000 lumens, which is pretty key. That's a brightness of light. So it is actually stimulating sunlight or simulating sunlight, which is important for resetting that circadian rhythm. And Lightbox here is something else that is, again, very similar. So, in summary, we've looked at sleep. We've looked at why it is important for us. We've looked at the short-term and the long-term health consequences of a lack of sleep. And hopefully I've given you some important tips that you can implement so that you maybe not quite sleep like a baby, but certainly improve the quality of your sleep, because it is very important for your daily performance and your long-term health.